In this video, I want to explain what Docker is. And I want to do it because I see on the Docker forum that many people don't know what they are using. They are asking about how they can run multiple Dockers on the same machine, but what they don't know is that they are using containers and not Dockers. So in this video, I want to explain what Docker is, and we will talk about Docker components and the differences between the version numbers of these components. When I talk about Docker, I usually mean the Docker daemon running on a server, for example. And you can also say that you want to use a product developed by Docker, or you can say that you want to subscribe the YouTube channel of Docker. In this case, you probably mean Docker as the company. And you can also talk about the software. For example, you can run Docker in a virtual machine, for example, using Docker Desktop. And you can also run Docker directly on a host. And if you choose running Docker Desktop, then you can run it on macOS, Windows, and also Linux. And the application that you can install on Windows and Linux is called Docker Desktop. But if you install Docker Desktop on macOS, you will see Docker in the menu. This is still Docker Desktop and not a native Docker on the host. It will not run macOS containers because there is no such thing as macOS container. And if you want to run Docker directly on the host, you have to know about the Moby project, which is the base of the Docker CE. And the Docker CE is the officially supported Docker, and this is what I recommend to use. But you can also install Docker from the Docker IO package, which is provided by Ubuntu from its own repository. This is not something I would recommend to use because it will not be supported by Docker and it will probably not be the latest version. You can also use the snap package, the Docker snap package, which is also something I would not recommend because this is still not an officially supported Docker, and this will run the Docker daemon in a container. So you will not be able to mount any files outside of your home directory. And there was the Docker E, which was the Docker Enterprise Edition, which is not there anymore because it was bought by Mirantis and they made the Mirantis container runtime and the Mirantis Kubernetes engine. And now we are here at the Docker daemon, which can be rootful or rootless. The rootless means that you don't need a root user to run the Docker daemon. And if you run the rootful Docker, it means that you will need a root user to run the Docker daemon. And that is the default behavior. And there is a client component of the Docker C, which is, for example, the Docker command. And you can also use Compose, Docker Compose, which had a version 1, and that is not developed anymore. So you should switch to Docker Compose v2, which is a plugin, a CLI plugin. Docker Compose v1 and v2 uses a compose file that is for describing your containers and networks and volumes and so on. And the difference is that Compose required a version number, which was the version number of the YAML syntax in the Compose file, and not the Docker Compose version at all. In Compose v2, all the versions were merged into one, so you don't need to define that version keyword, and if you define it, Compose v2 will warn you about that it is not necessary, and it might not work in the future at all. And now I have to talk about the Docker command again, because when you run a Docker command, for example, you want to create a new container and you use a Docker run command, then the Docker command will communicate with your Docker daemon using an API. The Docker daemon will not run containers directly, it will use containerd. And you can manage the Docker daemon using the Docker command, and you can also manage containerd using the nerdctl command. So the Docker daemon will communicate with the containerd daemon, and even that will not run containers directly. It will need a runtime. For example, the default runtime is runc. And there is a containerd shim between the containerd and the runtime because the containerd doesn't have to know how to parameterize the runtime. It doesn't know the arguments of the runtime, only the arguments of the containerd shim. And the containerd shim command has to be implemented for the runtime. And there is another software called Podman, which can pretend to be Docker, but it is not. In some cases, you can install Podman, and it will also install an alias called Docker. And this will be just an alias to the Podman command. And when you run the docker run command, for example, you will think that you are running Docker containers, but what you are doing is running Podman containers. This is possible because Podman has very similar interface to the interface of Docker, but you still need to know that this is not Docker. So the core components are the Docker C, the client of Docker C, the Docker command, and the Docker daemon, which can be rootful or rootless. And if you want to install these packages, you need to know what the package name is. And I already told you that you should not use the Docker IO package, which is provided by Ubuntu. You should use the official repository provided by Docker. And in that repository, all the packages has a prefix called Docker CE. And the Docker CE package itself will install the Docker daemon. And you can also have a Docker CE rootless extras package, which will install scripts that you can use to run a rootless Docker. And there is a Docker C CLI package, which is for the Docker command. Let's see a last summary of the Docker components. So the Docker C rootless extras, the Docker C CLI will have the same version number. You can use a different Docker C CLI if you want to, but if you want to make sure that the API of the Docker daemon is compatible with the Docker C CLI, then you should use the same versions. And there are the plugins and the Docker desktop and the Docker daemon dependencies, and those are all using different independent version numbers. And what is very important to know is that the Docker desktop version number is different than the Docker C version number. So when you come to the forum and you see that we ask for a version number, when we ask for the Docker C version number, we want to know the version of Docker running inside that virtual machine. And when we want to know the Docker desktop version, it means that you are probably asking about a feature which is in the Docker desktop, so we need to know what version of Docker desktop you are using. If you run the Docker version command, it will show you if you are using the Docker desktop, and it will show you the version number of the Docker desktop and also the version number of Docker CE. So that was it, and I really hope you learned something today, and next time you will know exactly what version numbers you have to share on the forum.